Within the runic language of the giants lies an ancient power. The Rune Knight harnesses this power by inscribing these runes onto their items and dominating their opponents. As they grow to towering heights, a Rune Knight becomes a towering force on the battlefield and in the minds of their other party members. They are a fun, thematic, and powerful fighter subclass to play, which is why I asked you to sit down so I can tell you why you should be playing a Rune Knight. This guide is based on my personal experiences and opinions. I won't be going over basic subclass information because you can probably read. I've either played or DM'd for all the fighter subclasses, and my opinions almost certainly won't align with the D&D community at large. I will be ranking the subclass based on 5 criteria. I will be scrutinizing subclass features gotten at later levels more intensely, because most players aren't going to make it past 10th level with a character, so my analysis is weighted more towards earlier subclass features. With all that out of the way, let's begin. First thing about a Rune Knight you gotta love are the runes. Runes are fantastic! You've got 6 of them that you get to use, and they all have their own passive ability and one that activates when you invoke the rune. So it's kind of like a 2-for-1 deal when you choose a rune. And since the inscription of this rune only lasts until you finish a long rest, you're not tied down by any particular items when you're playing a Rune Knight. Almost anything can hold your rune: a shield, a piece of jewelry, armor, or a legendary weapon. And this is a good thing because they're not just impactful in combat, but arguably more so outside of combat, providing a ton of variety for your character. Something like the Cloud rune, I'd argue, is better when it's not invoked than when you actually invoke it in combat. And you guys should know right now, I'm a big fan of fighters that not only focus on the combat portion of the game, but also in the general role-playing portion of the game. We also have to talk about Giant Might, because at 3rd level, you're not just getting one super impactful subclass feature, you're getting 2 subclass features. Because for the simple price of a bonus action, for 1 minute you grow to size large, get advantage on strength checks and saving throws, and you get some extra damage on a weapon hit or an unarmed strike. Plus, you get uses of this feature equal to your proficiency bonus. So as you go on, you're not really going to be in danger of expending all the uses of your Giant Might. You'll be able to use this in pretty much every single combat. Or you should feel comfortable using it outside of combat to aid with challenges. And again, did I mention you grow to be like 10 feet tall? There is just a lot of fun there when you start to supersize yourself in combat. There's just something about it that I can't deny that both players and DMs love. We like rolling lots of dice, we like killing bad guys, and we like being really big in combat. Somehow with the Rune Knight, you get to accomplish all 3 of those things, so it's a win in my book. And if you make it till 7th level with this subclass, you get Runic Shield! This is a fantastic ability that basically allows you to use your reaction to cause an attack to miss, sometimes. And you can do this a number of times equal to your proficiency bonus, which is pretty fair, and I have seen Rune Knights save other party members from devastating critical hits so often. That's right, you might have not been thinking about it like that, but this is a critical hit denial device. It is a giant fuck you to your DM whenever they try and score a critical hit on one of your allies. You get to look at them and say, actually, no, that's not a critical hit. And as a DM, yes, this rips the heart straight out of my chest, but as a player, oh, it is so good. And it has a range of 60 feet. 60 feet? Yeah, it's a fantastic ability. No one's going to dispute that, at least I would hope not. This is silvery barbs for a fighter and a powerful defensive ability, and combined with the runes and the Giant Might and the Runic Shield, the Rune Knight actually makes a really good tank. I'm not really going to talk about the later level abilities because they really are just solidifying the core 3 features you're getting at the start of this subclass. Because I think Wizards of the Coast knew that they hit 3 home runs with these and they could probably just stop there. But overall, this is a really tight overall concept for a subclass. You know exactly what you are, and all the ideas that you should have bubbling around in your head, ideally are reinforced by the mechanics of this subclass. And so therefore, let's go and just slide right into concepts when talking about the Rune Knight, because you're centering around runes and growth. And this is pretty easy to do because everything is centered around the rune theme, so it's very easy to think up characters around this mechanic. You just have to think of a character that works with runes, or really just marking things, really. And I'll say, they could be giant runes. It's very easy to roleplay a Rune Knight or create a Rune Knight that is centered around giant runes, but you could reflavor them into something else, like hag runes. A player of mine did this and was playing a character that was basically a witch that was inscribing things with her runes. And these symbols converted the energy around her into hag magic. It was a very fun concept to play. You could also do something with devilish or demonic runes, where your character is writing these dark glyphs in exchange for power. There's a lot you can do off of this very simple initial design. So I challenge you when you're making a Rune Knight to dive into what these runes are actually representing. Are they actually giant runes, or could you do something else with them? But now let's talk about multiclassing, and I think there is one very obvious multiclass. The Rune Knight has incredible synergy with the Monk class, because Giant Might also gives damage to unarmed strikes. Monks are always at a bit of a disadvantage when it comes to damage, but for the price of just 3 levels in Fighter, you'll be able to take the unarmed fighting style, Second Wind, Action Surge, and get this whole subclass which is aiding you in your unarmed strikes, adding an extra d6 to those strikes. So every unarmed strike will be 1d8 plus 1d6 plus your strength or dexterity. Add in a flurry of blows on turn 2, and man, you're really starting to cook there, aren't you? Rune Knight monks can tear through enemies with ruthless efficiency, but you can go for more than just monks because the Cloud Rune and the Stone Rune pair really well with a sneaky rogue. Having these passive abilities and buffs plus the core fighter subclass integrated with the rogue is really powerful. But while I am talking up these multi-classing potentials, really though, this subclass kind of stands on its own and works well within its own mechanics. Subclass features like Great Stature, Master of Runes, and Runic Juggernaut build off of what was laid in the opening few levels. If you're playing a Rune Knight, it is actually a choice on whether or not you should multiclass. Because if you really like what you're doing in the opening levels and you just want to do more of that as the campaign progresses, why multiclass? You're just going to be getting better at the things you're already having fun with. But that's not to say that this subclass is perfect, because let's get into some dislikes. And I think the biggest weakness of the Rune Knight is the lack of runes. Simply put, I don't think you know enough runes when you pick this subclass. And only being able to invoke runes once before Master of Runes at 15th level is kinda bad. A Rune Knight can feel a bit hamstrung by the lack of runes for 12 whole levels. Think about it, you have these powerful abilities in combat that you can only use once. At 3rd level, you only know 2 runes. Only 2 uses of these really fun and thematic abilities. And I hate to say it, but at opening levels, you kind of feel like an arcane archer. You don't have enough resources to be using the subclass abilities that you chose this subclass for. The saving grace of the Rune Knight is that they give you these passive abilities. But these passives, for the most part, are helpful outside of combat. In combat, you're still going to have to invoke the runes and burn them. I honestly think that you could swap Master of Runes at 15th level and Great Stature at 10th level and would be absolutely fine. I've done it for some mini campaigns and one-shots, and I think the Rune Knight was a lot more fun to play. And quite honestly, I didn't notice a big difference in power. I did notice, though, my players having a bit more fun. But the Rune Knight also has other problems, specifically the lack of offensive support. The Rune Knight falls behind other fighters in combat because their abilities are good, but they're not really primary damage dealers. The extra d6 off Giant Might can only be dealt once per turn, and invoking something like the Fire Rune is only an extra 2d6 fire damage. And honestly, I don't think that's good enough, and it doesn't scale really well. Fire is often resisted for creatures in D&D 5th edition. So while the Rune Knight has strong defensive capabilities and lots of utility, it's not going to be that typical frontline damage-dealing fighter that others might be used to. That's not to say that it cannot output damage, but when looking at other subclasses like the Samurai, or the Battle Master, or the Psy Warrior, or the Echo Knight, you're not really coming close to them. And finally, when we look at the runes, some are very situational with regard to their usefulness. Like, I take a look at the Frost rune, which gives you advantage on animal handling checks and intimidation checks. I'm not gonna lie, animal handling is a check I might use once per campaign. And a charisma intimidation check for a Rune Knight fighter is sketchy. Even with advantage, it might not help. And this is especially dependent on how your Dungeon Master runs the game. If you're able to make a lot of intimidation checks, this might be helpful. If you rarely roll these charisma checks, then you might be a little bit screwed. And this is a situation with the majority of the runes, where if they are able to be used, they're great. But if you can't use them because the situation doesn't come up, or because you literally don't know the rune, then you're screwed. Ideally, you should probably know every single rune and only have a limited number that you can inscribe at the end of a long rest. But who knows, the Rune Knight is by no means a bad subclass. It just does have some weaknesses and weird idiosyncrasies that players who are looking to play a Rune Knight should probably know about. So let's get to the ratings. 5 categories as always: roleplay, offensive, defensive, utility, and X Factor. X Factor, of course, is what makes your subclass unique. When we're looking at roleplay, we'll go with a 14 out of 20. The Rune Knight has a solid roleplay foundation. I think they do this subclass a little bit of a detriment by making it giant only in how they kind of describe it, but I can understand why they're doing it because Wizards of the Coast is trying to push more giant related content, but it also kind of necessitates for your character to be built entirely around the concept of these runes, which a majority of players might not want to do. On the offensive category though, we're going to give the Rune Knight a solid 12 out of 20. Giant Might is giving it consistent extra damage every turn, and the Rune Knight can invoke the Fire rune for some extra fire damage. Does that make this subclass an offensive powerhouse? No, I don't think anyone in their right mind would be arguing that. And so because of that, the Rune Knight is just a bit better than average when it comes to its offensive rating. When we turn to the defensive rating though, completely different story. The Rune Knight's getting an 18 out of 20. Rune Knight is great on the defensive, especially when you're able to reach 7th level and all your defensive abilities start to come online. But even before that, runes like the Cloud rune or the Fire rune with its ability to restrain targets just help prevent damage. Plus, something like the Frost rune gives an extra +2 to strength and constitution saving throws. And Giant Might is giving you advantage on strength saves and strength checks, which means that this is actually a fantastic grappling subclass. And while grappling isn't great when it comes to damage, it's fantastic for keeping enemies away from other party members. And since you're going to size large, you can be grappling bigger creatures. So we cannot underrate the Rune Knight when it comes to its defensive rating, and we certainly cannot underrate it when we're talking about its utility. The Rune Knight gets a 20 out of 20 when it comes to its utility. This is one of the best fighters outside of combat. Are some of the runes situational? Yes. But if you figured out which type of campaign you're in and what your DM style is, you can be picking the right runes. Because when you level up, you can swap out a rune that you know, and that is extremely beneficial. And this is on top of the bonus proficiencies that are provided to you when you are taking this subclass at 3rd level. And of course, Giant Might just gives you advantage on strength checks or athletics checks. And if you're doing skill challenges in your D&D groups, well, you are going to be an absolute powerhouse during those skill challenges because you're basically going to be getting 1 success every single time with your advantage on your strength checks. That is doubly so if you use the Fire rune to give yourself expertise in an ability check of your choice. At least if you have a tool that relates to that specific ability check, which you have proficiency in. It's a little bit weird and it can be situational, but having expertise in an ability check is very good. Is the Rune Knight a bit wonky sometimes? It can be, but when you're dialed in, oh yeah, you are going to be a force outside of combat. And now let's finish up with the X Factor. And this X Factor is going to be a 14 out of 20. I really like the Rune Knight's runes. I just wish they were more consistent and you knew more of them and you could invoke the runes multiple times, at least more than one. Honestly, with just a few simple changes, this X Factor score could also be a 20 out of 20. But even with all this, the Rune Knight still comes out to a respectable 78 out of 100 for the score. This is a really solid fighter subclass that I would highly recommend new players and veterans look at. If the idea of inscribing runes and drawing power for them intrigues you, then this is a solid subclass that you can play into later levels. And the better you learn how your runes work, the stronger you'll become. Having a strong Rune Knight is reflective in the actual writing of the runes. You have to pay attention to detail. You have to learn all the fine intricacies of a Rune Knight. But if you can do that, you will have a powerful force to help your party. Maybe you're looking for something a little bit simpler though, and if that's the case, might I suggest this video right here. This subclass is less complex, but still a lot of fun. And thank you all for entering the dungeon.